With the House recently passing the SAVE Act, which has the goal of mandating a birth certificate or passport with registering to vote, there's been a lot of discussion on ID and voting. Republicans say this is an obvious thing to be passed, with extremist Democrats who want illegal aliens to vote wanting to stop it. While Democrats say the act will add unnecessary difficulty to voting for people who change their name, most commonly married women, with non-citizen voting being extremely rare. But that brought me to this video here, and the research that's been done for it. Do people really vote in elections without proper ID? How common is it for non-citizens to vote? Are Democrats trying to have illegal immigrants vote, or is this fear-mongering by Republicans? Hey guys, I'm your host Dylan, and today I'm not trying to spread any political beliefs. I just really want to understand an issue that is big talk in politics right now. I'll look at what the research, the data, and the statistics say, while keeping my biases out as much as possible. First, I'll look at the current Fed and state law and its results. Then, the history of non-citizen voting. Then, what are the theoretical effects of the SAVE Act, including the political ones. And as is a tradition on this channel, if you catch any mistakes I make in this video, leave a comment and I'll correct it in the pinned comment down below. But before any of that fun stuff, what is the current status quo when voting in the US? Does the law allow states to leave a door open for non-citizens to vote? The straightforward answer is this: not really. In 49 out of 50 states, you need to register before you can vote, usually weeks or months in advance. The exception is North Dakota, where you can walk into a voting booth and register on the spot. In registering, you have to say whether you're a citizen or not. But who cares about saying if you're a citizen or not? How do you prove it? Well, according to federal voter registration forms, applicants must check a box that they are citizens and sign under a penalty of perjury. So yeah, you check a box. Doesn't sound great. And worse, when you include that there is no automatic federal citizenship database to check if you're telling the truth. States can run post-registration checks themselves, but that varies by state, as you can see on the graph here. But that's fine. Federal law is meant to be limited, so states can expand the laws in the ways that specific states want to. Well, about that, states actually can't add a thing. States can add more steps for registering, like changing what ID, if at all, is needed for registration, but they can't touch proof of citizenship at all. The most popular example was in Arizona v. Intertribal Council of Arizona Incorporated, where the US Supreme Court ruled that Arizona could not require extra proof of citizenship beyond the federal form's attestation for federal elections. Even the federal government has a difficult time affecting the status quo. The most famous example of this was from March 2025, when the Trump administration issued an executive order titled Preserving and Protecting the Integrity of American Elections, attempting to require documentary proof of citizenship. In October 2025, a US district court blocked the requirement from altering the registration form. But what does this actually lead to? How many non-citizens end up voting? Well, given the shadowy nature of the people involved, it's tough to track, leading to vast differences in estimations. One survey found anywhere between 10 to 20% of non-citizens were registered to vote, and another found a total of 30 total non-citizens voted in the 2016 election, accounting for 0.0001% of the votes casted. So one says millions and one says 30. Well, that's not great. But one thing to keep in mind is that the high estimate is heavily contested compared to the low estimate, with a large group of researchers critiquing its methodology, with them saying that the source includes large amounts of people that just didn't register to vote or put wrong information on their form, even if they are citizens. There's such a large amount of skepticism and critiquing of its methods that the numbers should be taken with a lot of skepticism. So in all likelihood, there should be more research on the subject, but the number of non-citizens voting in American elections is statistically unimportant. But here's the thing almost nobody knows, and this was so interesting for me to learn myself. Non-citizen voting was once completely legal in the United States. In order to encourage immigration, many states in the US allowed non-citizen voting in the country in as early as 1704, and by the end of the century, non-citizens were legally and regularly voting nearly all state and federal elections. This wasn't too crazy at the time because voting rights were more tied to property, residency, and race rather than citizenship status. This practice was widespread, with modern historical estimates suggesting that approximately 40 states at some point or another allowed non-citizens to vote prior to 1926. You'll see why that date's important later. And 11 out of 13 of the states at the founding allowed for it in some capacity. We can clearly see examples from this in early constitutions of states like Illinois and Ohio, where non-citizen residents could vote under residency conditions and race ones. However, at the turn of the century, with growing anti-immigrant sentiment, especially against Irish and German Catholic immigrants after the War of 1812, many states, especially northeastern ones, began restricting non-citizen voting rights in the early 19th century. And by the 1830s, most states have removed non-citizen suffrage as part of broader electoral reforms. From this point, it looked like non-citizen voting was going to end any year now. Then the 1840s happened, and non-citizen voting rebounded strongly. In many states across the mid-19th century, especially in the new western states and territories that wanted to encourage settlement, non-citizen voting rights were introduced. The number of states permitting non-citizen voting reached a high point around the 1870s, when it was still legal in more than a dozen states. During that decade, a court ruling in Minor v. Happersett in 1875 included the Supreme Court of the United States saying that citizenship is not automatically the sole qualification for voting, and that states had the authority to determine voting rules. But then the 1900s happened, and an anti-immigration feeling ran high once again. Alabama stopped allowing non-citizens to vote by way of a constitutional change in 1901, Colorado in 1902, Wisconsin in 1908, Oregon in 1914. And just as nationalism and anti-immigrant sentiment nearly wiped out non-citizen voting after the War of 1812, World War I caused the same effect of mass removing of non-citizenship suffrage policies. In 1918, Kansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota all purged non-citizen suffrage, and Texas and Indiana in 1921, followed by Mississippi in 1924, and finally, the last state in the US that allowed non-citizen voting, Arkansas, in 1926. In 1931, the political scientist Leon Allsworth noted that for the first time in over 100 years, a national election was held in 1928 in which no alien in any state had the right to cast a vote for a candidate for any office, national, state, or local. But the most important thing of all, virtually no one in America knows this history. How many Texans do you think know that their state allowed illegal immigrants to vote a little over 100 years ago? But the big question here is, how will this new act add on to the history of increasingly hard restrictions on non-citizen voting if it passes? Well, let's delve into a few myths, lies, and strawmans along the way. First, a simple explanation of the SAVE Act is that it wants to amend the 1993 National Voter Registration Act to require documentary proof of citizenship for federal elections. This would include a passport, a birth certificate, or a naturalization certificate. And notice the exclusion of a driver's license. The enforcement of this law would come from cross-check voter rolls against federal databases. For example, citizenship data, and to remove non-citizens identified on the rolls. As of February 23rd, it has already passed the US House by 218 to 213 with one Democrat vote. It seems pretty difficult not to support, right? How in the world could 213 people not want ID to be mandatory in elections? Well, there's one major issue that dissenters commonly bring up: married women. Only around 50% of Americans have a passport, widely different by what state you live in. And there's no issue for men, who can easily just use their birth certificate. But it is a potential worry for the roughly 70 million married women whose last name does not match that of their birth certificate in the vast majority of cases. Then, those people without a working birth certificate would have to pay a kind of tax and lost hours by getting a passport, which are illegal in the US. You cannot have any sort of voting or polls tax. It would also effectively eliminate in-mail or online voter registration by mandating in-person verification, which is a bummer for voter registration, as mail-in and online registration has been shown to increase voting participation. And if you look at a similar law passed in Kansas in 2013, around 30% of registrations were denied, 99.9% of which were believed to be citizens who just did not find out that they were denied in most cases until they were at the place of voting. Then there's the concerns that groups that would be most affected by this law would be poor, rural, minorities, and immigrants. They state that the risk of unequal and potentially discriminatory effects is not worth it due to the low levels of non-citizen voting recorded in the past. Basically, dissenters are saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. However, it's not a one-sided issue. With a form of voter ID for federal elections being supported by over 75% of the population, you can't find any issue like that in the US. Supporters say that instituting the SAVE Act would be a response to concerns about non-citizen registration and voting, a way to boost public confidence in elections, and provide a federal authority under the Constitution and existing laws to set voter qualification standards. But the big question in every politician, political analyst, and president's minds is, what will the courts say? The truthful answer is we really don't know, but we may have some hints. Legal scholars and critics raise multiple constitutional questions. The US Constitution gives states primary authority to run elections. Critics argue a federal mandate on registration could conflict with that authority. However, we have seen laws in the past that do something similar that have not been struck down. They also bring up that if a law disproportionately burdens certain groups' ability to register and vote, especially by taking away and not providing alternatives, opponents argue that this could violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Some lawyers, like the critics say, raise questions about poll tax concerns by basically creating a de facto financial barrier with passports. Election law cases often hinge on administrative feasibility and preemptive questions, which courts have split on in other voting right disputes, suggesting that whatever the court's answer is on the SAVE Act, it won't be very clear and litigation will follow. But at least in our current system, it will almost definitely get partially blocked in trial and appeals courts before the final statement from the Supreme Court 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 months later. The current court usually sides with the Republican side, but not 100% of the time, as we can see with the tariff case. Anyways, no reason to think too much about it because it still needs to get passed by the Senate by 60 votes, and that's not easy, to say the least. But what needs to be thought about is objectively what's going on with the court systems right now. It feels like they've never been so politicized and are being pushed to the breaking point. But is that actually true, or are we being carried away by the moment? I did an entire objective look into whether Trump is breaking the court systems that you can check out right here. And don't forget to check your birth certificate, check if your registration went through, and think controversy. I'll catch you over in this video right here.